Paul Joseph Watson on the phone from the UK. You know, there's a lot of different kinds of wars going on right now. We've got Obama conducting a war on the economy with Obamacare. We also have a war on children that is developing, a war on family, and we're going to be talking to Paul Joseph Watson about that. We're also going to be talking to him about the real war that is on the brink, that's going on in the Ukraine, that is building up as a civil war in the Ukraine and the Crimea. Is that going to expand into a wider war? Is that going to get NATO and the U.S. involved? They're playing a very dangerous game of brinksmanship. And later on in the program, we're going to be talking to Kathleen Willey, one of the women that accused Bill Clinton of sexually assaulting her. And she's going to be talking about what she perceives as the real war on women. So stay tuned for that. But right now, let's talk to Paul Joseph Watson about what he thinks about this war that is actually a real war. We have all these metaphorical wars, Paul, but we got a war that is coming up right to the edge. NATO is warning that Russia is risking Europe's peace and security. I don't know. I think NATO has some involvement in that too, don't you?
Well, now we've got, over the past hour or so, David, this deadline that Russia has imposed on Ukrainian forces in Crimea. And they're basically saying that by 3 a.m. UK time, which is 9 a.m. where you are, Ukrainian army in Crimea have to basically surrender and give up all their military bases so that Russian troops can take them over. Otherwise, they're going to take them by force. So this is really the biggest escalation we've seen so far in this conflict, now that Putin has slapped a time deadline on Ukrainian forces in Crimea to surrender, which suggests that this could indeed go hot within the next 12 hours or so if those forces in Crimea don't surrender.
Well, you know, clearly it's taken them by surprise, taking the Obama administration and John Kerry and others by surprise. We talked to Joel Scows, and I thought he made a very good point last week. He expected that Putin would wait a while. He thought that because of the publicity and the press and the Western press that's being used, he thought that Putin would wait, let some things happen in Crimea, try to make a case that he had to come in to protect the minorities in the Crimea, and that he basically would kind of wait so that he would have a PR game to play. But Putin is not waiting for that. He basically doesn't really care what Clinton or what Kerry or what Obama or what the West or NATO thinks. He's going to act in what he perceives to be his best interest, apparently.
Well, I mean, that's right. He's calling their bluff, isn't he?
Yeah.
We saw a lot of criticism for Obama over his weak statements.
Yeah.
Kerry came out with some stronger statements about economic sanctions. But again, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So Putin knows there's going to be no military backlash, even if he does go ahead, most likely, with this attempt to seize the Ukrainian bases that haven't already been given up or surrendered. Because, of course, we had reports a couple of days ago about how many of the Ukrainian forces were already surrendering because, of course, Crimea is now almost exclusively run by pro-Russian forces, or in fact, Russian troops occupying the entire region. But the interview with Skousen was interesting because, of course, he posited the notion that this entire revolution from the very beginning was started by Putin himself, was a kind of a long game that he was playing. I tend to disagree with that still, because further revelations have emerged about who funded the initial protests that led to this overthrow of the democratically elected government of Ukraine back in November. And these emerged just a couple of days ago, and the documents which have been released quite clearly reveal that the US State Department, under US aid, provided more than half of the budget for one of the main protest groups, the NGOs that was involved right at the beginning of this uprising, and it was called Center UA, which under the umbrella of that NGO has numerous other organizations, including Chesno and Stop Censorship. So these governments have emerged confirming that the State Department under US aid provided the majority of their budget for 2012, and that the goal, according to this character called Ole Rybarchuk, who's kind of the leader of that umbrella group of NGOs, said was to, well, he said, we want to do the Orange Revolution again, and we think we will. Now, he was involved in the 2004 Orange Revolution. He said, we now have 150 NGOs in all the major cities. This was a few months ago, right when the protests started. So he's the head of that umbrella organization that was provably funded by the State Department right at the inception of the protests. So this is bombshell revelation evidence that it was completely contrived from the very beginning, again, at around the same time that Victoria Nuland went to Ukraine and said the U.S. has invested $5 billion for the same goal.
And she makes this phone call on an unsecured line to the Ukrainian ambassador and pretends that she's astonished when it's heard and commented on by the Russians. I just feel sorry for the Ukrainian people. One of the things that Skousen said was that he believed that there was a genuine pushback on of the people of the street. I think they're being used. They see the corruption of both sides. And, of course, after the Orange Revolution, the guy that got put in charge was a former central banker. And there's an article from the New American today says the new interim government has too many familiar faces. I'm reminded of the song by The Who, We Won't Be Fooled Again. You know, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. They're talking about how these guys are being put in are a lot of the same old oligarchs. And these are people who were related to Yanukovych and others who are now getting, 50% of the state contracts. They're some of the richest billionaires in the world. These are the people that they're seeing on both sides. It doesn't seem to matter whether it's the Russian puppets or the Western bank puppets that get put in. The bottom line is the poor people of the Ukraine are seeing nothing but despotism and corruption in the government, no matter which way it goes. And so, yeah, part of what Skousen said, and I agreed with this part of it definitely, was that the Russians saw a very real reaction, frustration. Obviously, you can't get that many people to show up in the streets unless they're truly frustrated about something. But I do believe that they're being used by both of these groups. They're being used by people who are corrupt oligarchs that have taken the place of the Russians, and that's what we see happening now. Same people coming back into the new government.
Well, of course, the Prime Minister, Yatsenyuk, was hand-selected by Nuland in that leaked phone conversation, so he's been put into power already.
Yes.
But an aspect of it that's not been focused on, not just by the mainstream media, but by anyone, is the energy aspect of this, because you had Chevron and Exxon, who were deeply involved in fracking, natural gas drilling, over the last couple of years in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Now, Gazprom, which of course is the Russian-controlled monopoly corporation, the Russian government owns a majority share in it, basically has a monopoly on natural gas provided to Europe. So, as I document in the article, trade war, Gazprom threatens to disrupt gas supplies to Europe, which today they've come out and threatened that the political turmoil could cause gas supply shortages to Europe, which of course means higher prices. As I warned last week when I said with the IMF taking over, you're going to see a Greece-style ratcheting up of austerity fascism. Now that's admitted that gas prices are going to go up for Ukrainian citizens. So, as you said, they're not going to benefit at all from this. And that frontier of the energy aspect of this is looking like it could blow up into a trade war, because Gazprom fears that NATO and the US, through corporations like Chevron and Exxon, could take over their monopoly in Europe over that natural gas. So that's a major aspect of it that's being ignored.
Well, exactly. You got a possibility of a trade war erupting, and that would benefit some economic interests that are very well connected with the American government. You've also got the possibility of a new Cold War, which everybody is talking about right now. If we foment revolution right at the doorstep of Russia, some people would say within Russia, depending on your perspective, if we foment that, that's going to lead to a new Cold War. And, of course, that's going to benefit the military-industrial complex. They lost that huge profit center back in 1989 when no one could see the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation. They couldn't see them as a credible threat to us anymore. They had to invent the threat of terrorism. And now, of course, they've got a whole new profit center, and that is the police state industrial complex that they're gearing up for here domestically. But they still want these foreign wars, and they would just dearly love to have another Cold War with Russia, because that would bring in a whole new spectrum of weapons that they could sell to the U.S. military. So from both a new Cold War as well as a new trade war, there's a lot of justification from their perspective, something that they would benefit from if the corporations and the State Department get their way. But it's a very, very dangerous brinksmanship, because this could very easily get out of their control and become a real war, couldn't it?
Well, that's the fear, definitely. But I would argue that we've already been in a kind of proxy Cold War since the Obama administration announced that it would pivot towards Asia. And since that point, both China and Russia have been building up militarily on a massive scale, coming out with aggressive war rhetoric. And as you said, because of the threat of terrorism is seemingly fading in their ability to sell it to the American people as a genuine threat, you will notice that in China, when they had a knife attack over the weekend, the state media downplayed it, as opposed to the US media. After every single terror attack, they hype it beyond all reasonable expectation because they profit from it through the military-industrial complex. But I think we're already in that Cold War phase, and that the US is now going to seek justification to build up their military-industrial complex once again, just as China and Russia have been doing. But another one of these revelations that you may find interesting, David, because I think you've talked about this in the past, is that another one of the characters linked to funding these protest groups, these NGOs that started the Ukrainian revolution, is eBay founder Pierre Omidyar, who basically covered the rest of the budget for this main umbrella protest group, Center UA. So 54% of it was paid for by the US State Department. The rest of it was paid for by this Pierre Omidyar. And he, of course, is also the billionaire owner of Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill's First Look media project, which, of course, controls all the Edward Snowden files.
Yes.
So I actually asked Greenwald about this on the weekend, because he got some flack for this, and to some extent I feel sorry for Greenwald, because he gets a lot of flack about why don't you release all the Snowden files at once, which I think is a stupid move, because that would ensure that it wouldn't stay in the media spotlight for an elongated amount of time, which it is at the moment because they're doling them out. But I think this was a genuine criticism, because Greenwald wrote an article for his First Look website funded by this billionaire who is also funding the Ukrainian protesters. And he basically admitted that he did no research whatsoever on the political background of Pierre Omidyar.
Yeah.
Now, that seems very strange to me, that you would have someone handing you $250 million to start a media project and that you wouldn't even research their political background. Now, he denied that, it would interfere with his journalistic independence. He tweeted that back at me. But what if this individual was linked, for example, to neo-Nazis? I mean, that would impugn his work. That would smear his work.
And it's very troubling to see this, because, we see that he's actually, Pierre Omidyar is actually one of the largest globalist bankers with his involvement with PayPal. I mean, he is one of the major up-and-coming power bases here, along with people like Jeff Bezos, who paid $250 million for the Washington Post. Why? Because he wants to be a player in Washington. That's why, obviously. If you own the Washington Post, you've got a lot of clout in Washington. And so Pierre Omidyar, I think, kind of defensively started up this network that he put Glenn Greenwald and others in charge of, and said, I'm going to spend $250 million. I'm tit for tat type of thing. I'm not going to be left out of this. There's a competition between these Silicon Valley billionaires, and they understand the political importance of controlling the media. And that really is a bid that they're going for. And we see not only in the Ukraine, but Pierre Omidyar has got a terrible track record with microfinancing in India, the terrible things that happen to people there. I would encourage people to look that up. Look up microfinancing in India and see what happened with the Omidyar network in that area. That's very, very disturbing. It doesn't portray a picture of an altruistic, philanthropic billionaire like they like to portray Pierre Omidyar.
Well, that's right, David. And what confuses me is the fact that Greenwald said that he basically had no involvement in the political direction of this First Look media project, which controls all the Snowden files. But then Scahill admitted separately, quote, Pierre writes more on our internal messaging than anyone else. So he has a direct and consistent hand in the direction of that media organization. So while Scahill constantly talks about being an adversarial role against the state. They're being funded by somebody who works with the US government to fund these regime change operations around the world. So that was very disconcerting for me. I did invite Greenwald on the show, which I previously believed he'd been reluctant to appear on the Alex Jones show in the past. He indicated that he would be willing to appear on the show. So we're trying to set that in motion. I said we'd get our guys to contact him. So the floor is open for him to respond on that. And even aside from that, I said it would be a great idea because he could reach a whole new audience anyway. So hopefully that can happen.
Well, it'd be very interesting to have him on because I know he was singled out and attacked by Palantir and others. There were WikiLeaks put out the documents where they were plotting to do dirty tricks against him to assassinate his character. And then we see that in response to that, they tried to shut down WikiLeaks and so forth. All that stuff was happening. He mentioned Peter Thiel and his involvement with PayPal, but he didn't talk about Pierre Omidyar's involvement with the PayPal 14, as a protest against the actions of Bank of America and PayPal and others. You had a lot of independent activists known as the PayPal 14 who did what they considered to be just a digital sit-in. They didn't affect any of the transactions that were going on in PayPal. They just basically took over PayPal's homepage that talked about the institution, which people don't typically go to. And they saw that, and their lawyer saw that as the equivalent of a digital protest of somebody going into someone's restaurant and sitting at the counter because they won't serve black people or something like that. So that was the way they saw it. But they came after them, and Pierre Omidyar was a part of this. PayPal came after those protesters with very serious felony charges, and that drug on for years. So it'd be interesting to see how he views that kind of back and forth, with the PayPal group, with WikiLeaks, with Julian Assange. It'll be interesting to see that happens.
The globalist social engineers are not just targeting us with propaganda. They are manipulating our genetics. We are being targeted at every level by estrogen mimickers that lower our testosterone and other hormones and natural compounds that the body needs. After consulting top doctors, nutritionists, pharmacists, and others, we have developed what I believe is the ultimate non-GMO organic super male vitality formula sourced from powerful organic herbs and then concentrated for maximum potency. Super Male Vitality was developed to activate your body's own natural processes instead of using synthetic chemicals. Super Male Vitality by InfoWars Life is so powerful that I only take half the recommended dose. For a limited time, we are offering 15% off Super Male Vitality at InfoWarsLife.com to introduce you to this powerful supplement. Visit InfoWarsLife.com today to secure your Super Male Vitality. InfoWarsLife.com.
Looks like the new boss is going to be the same as the old boss, but it's also something that affects us because we've got a State Department and an administration, or I should call them a regime is a more accurate expression, but they are on the verge of creating a much larger war than just an internal conflict. This is very dangerous brinksmanship. We've been talking about that with Paul Joseph Watson. We still have him on the phone. But, Paul, I would like to go over, and I'd like to change subjects now and talk about this article that's up on InfoWars today. The London mayor calls for the state to take children based on the parents' political beliefs. Now, you and I spoke last week, and we talked about how after a year, Scotland passed this bill that would assign a government minder to children at birth, and they would have someone from the government assigned to each child through the age of 18. And what an outrageous thing that was, to the presumption that the state cared more about the children and knew better than the parents what that individual child needed. But you pointed out at the time that they had already done this, where they have gone after the political beliefs, taken a child away because of the parents' political beliefs, and it was something that was for the UK Independence Party, which is really a mainstream party. Now they're doubling down with these comments from the London mayor.
Well, that's right. First, to finish off on the previous subject, the Russian Defense Ministry is now actually denying the reports which were put out by Sky News and others that there's this 3 a.m. deadline on Russian forces seizing Ukrainian military bases in Crimea. So if true, that's good news that they haven't imposed that deadline, but we'll get that article up. But the London mayor, Boris Johnson, wrote in his weekly column that the law should obviously treat radicalization as a form of child abuse. And he's talking about using social services to target parents with, quote, extremist, radical political beliefs. And the example that he cited, of course, because it's the most justifiable, reasonable example, was extremist Muslims who might teach their children to become suicide bombers. Mm-hmm. But then if you read further down into the article, he also says that it could be applied under more vague circumstances, such as if the child is taught to be, quote, full of hate.
Yes.
And he actually linked that with the BNP, which is a right-wing British national party that vehemently opposes immigration, is linked with neo-Nazis. But you can see the slippery slope, because as you mentioned, in 2012, up in Rotherham, the local government council there removed 2 children from the care of foster parents who had an exemplary record due to the fact that they were members of UKIP, which is the 3rd largest political party in Britain, expected to win the European parliamentary elections later this year. And the reason they gave for removing these kids from their care was the fact that they belonged to a, quote, racist party. Yeah, and right. How they judged the fact that the party was racist was because its platform opposes the, quote, active promotion of multiculturalism. So if you oppose mass immigration and the imposition of multiculturalism, which even people like the German Chancellor Angela Merkel have denounced, that means you're a racist.
Yes.
So you can see how easily this could be applied to seize children from parents with extremist radical beliefs. Of course, according to the government and the establishment, a radical belief is something that differs from the PC orthodoxy, which, as you've seen in America with the Department of Homeland Security characterizing, quote, liberty lovers as extremists, you can see the slippery slope that this could well lead to.
And just before the break, we were talking about what's going on in the UK. We have the mayor of London now saying that he's going to perhaps look at the religious beliefs of people that he labels as radical, and maybe the government ought to take those children from them. And of course, this is all a relative term here, isn't it, Paul? When they start talking about people being racist, we're reminded that they've also talked about people being racist if they oppose even any kind of immigration. But we also see that when they start talking about hate, we've seen that applied to mainstream evangelical groups. As I mentioned just before the break, we had the Southern Poverty Law Center, as I like to call them the Southern Poverty Law Pimps, because they always are pimping this narrative. And we see that the U.S. military, in many scenarios, is repeating what they say and linking mainstream evangelical Christian organizations like the Family Research Council, linking them with the Ku Klux Klan and other groups that have been identified as racist hate groups, just so that people start to think of Christianity that way. It's a very troubling thing, and now we see the mayor of London coming out for that, as at the same time that we see the government is assigning a minder to children in Scotland from birth until the age of 18. So anything else you wanted to address about that, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, the SPLC and the ADL, there was actually a gunman who attacked a Family Research Council facility and tried to massacre a bunch of people.
Yes.
Because he believed the SPLC propaganda about them being, evangelical extremists. So they talk about violence and use it to demonize conservative groups. When the gunman was violent or attempted to be violent, he was neutralized by a security guard based on their propaganda. So they were the ones instigating the violence. But yeah, it's part of the state getting its tentacles into every aspect of people's lives. I did an article a couple of years ago about a case in America where a father of 2 was harassed by CPS workers because he refused to make his children drink tap water, and he fed them organic food. So that was reason enough for the CPS to conduct an investigation, a warrantless search of his home and the contents of his refrigerator. So you can see how easily this can slide into absolute tyranny. And it's, the Scottish law has been passed. Children up to the age of 18 have a guardian state minder interfering in family lives, trying to find any reason to prosecute child abuse, which of course will reduce the possibility of finding actual child abuse, because now it's such a target-rich environment because every parent is treated as a potential child abuser.
That's right, and I guess if you're okay if you give your children bread that's made with a chemical they use to make rubber mats, but if you're really concerned about their food, that's right. If you're concerned about their food, then basically you're paranoid and you're dangerous. Maybe you're a conspiracy theorist if you're concerned about genetic modification, transgenetic modification of our food. That they can use that for anything, and that's the really troubling thing. We see that happening within the schools. We see it happening over and over again. The government really wants control of everything. We see that happening with the FDA, and we're going to be talking to Anthony Gucciardi about the overreach of the FDA. We've seen it happening with the FCC. They're now trying to extend their tentacles into the internet. You know, this is an organization that was started initially just to allocate bandwidth between different radio stations, and now they're trying to move themselves into content. So there's this kind of creeping intrusion from all these different bureaucracies. They never seem to get enough control of our lives.
Well, yeah, and they sell it all on, you know, cracking down on extremism and radicalism. Then you actually look at what the government defines as extremism and radicalism, and it's basically protest any political viewpoint that's not the orthodoxy, feeding your kids organic food, being a member of UKIP. It's basically anything.
You are watching the best of the Alex Jones Show, weekdays from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Central. Watch live at Infowars.com/show or become a member of InfoWarsNews.com and help us take resistance to the next level.